Oh, and on this slide, you see the remains of Midugsa. This is the Midugshadi, the remains of the Maitreya monastery from Paekche that I will talk a little bit more about in a little bit. The structure of this lecture, basically, the lecture has three parts, a short introduction, and then I will be focusing on the latter two periods of Paekche, the Ungdin period and the Sabi period, because we have the most renowned gold artifacts from Paekche that are from the Ungdin period, and we will discuss a few items. And then when we get to the Sabi period, we actually have a lot of excavations that uncovered Buddhist artifacts. And so I will be showing you a couple of Buddhist pieces from the Sabi period. And just in terms of the time frame, keep in mind that the Paekche kingdom basically existed from around the late 4th century CE to the mid 7th century CE. So methodologically speaking, traditionally, Paekche is believed to have started in 18 BCE, but that is more like a myth. We have art historical, archaeological, and textual evidence as early as 390. Early Korea scholars say that basically the three kingdoms, Goguryeo, Paekche, Shilla, actually really started as kingdoms, as united kingdoms around the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century CE. You will be all going to Gongju, right? And so that's the Ungdin period of Paekche, where we have the Paekche gold. And then the Sabi period is a little bit later, mostly 6th and 7th century CE. And you will be looking at these items in a little bit. So just in general, talking about Paekche's geopolitical advantage before we get into the details of artifacts. So just keep in mind, when we look at Paekche, Paekche is located at the southwestern part of the Korean peninsula. So it was basically, had to cross the ocean and would be exposed to all these various types of Chinese states. And if you're a little bit familiar with Chinese history, you know that, there were many different states and they were changing all the time. So looking at this map from around 500 CE, we see that there were the northern Wei in the north and the southern Qi in the south, but that changed all the time, these dynasties. And so what was the advantage of being at the periphery of the Chinese cultural sphere with all these different dynasties, southern Qi, southern Liang, western Wei, etc.? It's basically like the European states on the periphery of the Roman Empire, right? A kingdom like Paekche was able to maintain its own political identity, but at the same time, they were able to learn institutions like technology, and there was kind of a cultural transfer going on as well between the Chinese states and Paekche. And then Paekche adopted, modified these different items, and then would transfer that knowledge also to Japan. And we talk about pre-modern Korea, it makes the most sense to not use terms such as Korea, Japan, China, because they were all these different dynasties and kingdoms. And when we talk about Paekche, Paekche is very different from the Korea today, right? Those terms, Japan, Korea, are more references to modern nation states. And so when we talk about pre-modern Korea, it makes the most sense to talk about Joseon Korea, Paekche Korea, Shilla, etc., etc. And so I will be using mostly those specific terms rather than talking about Korea or Japan more generally. Another slide before we get to Paekche gold is I want you to think critically about the sources. How do we actually know about Paekche from our 21st century viewpoint? So there is Korean source material from the Samguk-sagi, but as you all know, this is Goryeo material. So it is much, much later, and it shows a Goryeo perspective. The Samguk-sagi, for instance, doesn't really mention Gaia, right? So why did they not talk about Gaia? So we have to be very careful with using Korean source material. What is more useful for the study of Paekche is actually ancient Chinese texts and also archaeological sites. So the ancient Chinese texts, such as the Liangshu, the Nanshu, etc., they provide a lot more information about the people and their beliefs, etc. So they're a little bit more detailed, but Sinocentric, right? They were looking at Paekche as the kind of barbarians that are not part of the big dynasties on the Chinese side. And what we also have are these archaeological sites, and they're mostly tombs. the nice thing about King Muryong's tomb is that it had never been touched by grave robbers, right? So we have this whole amount of all the grave goods that had been originally interred in that tomb. But in many other cases, those tombs actually have been robbed. And what remains for archaeologists to discover are basically just what the robbers did not want was still left in the tombs. And so our understanding of what types of objects were left in the tombs is somewhat biased, right? Because the grave robbers basically took the most precious pieces. And what's really important for art historians is the golden artifacts, the silver, the gold bronze objects, Buddha sculptures, stone carved Buddhas, and also ceramics, which I don't have much time to talk about today. But all of these artifacts are just great to look at in terms of their style, in terms of their iconography, in terms of their function and context, geographical, topographical context, because they tell us a lot about interaction between Paekche and other countries or dynasties in the East Asian larger cultural sphere. So yeah, archaeologists, historians, art historians all bring together these different methodologies to a deeper understanding of Paekche. And also, lastly, keep in mind that the study of Paekche is a fairly new field in Korean archaeology. So it only began in the 1990s. So it's just like, 30 or so years old. The study of Goguryeo in Silla is much older. It goes back more than 100 years because Japanese archaeologists began that field basically in the early 20th century. So we can look forward to more discoveries. There are still many excavations going on, and there will probably be more discoveries, in the next couple of years. Okay, now we're getting to the gold artifacts from Paekche from the Ungjin period. The use of gold is nothing new, right? And I will be talking about just a few items to show you general trends and then also some specificities with Paekche gold. Okay, and if you look at the top of the slide, you see a pair of gold earrings of the queen consort of King Muryong. So this dates from the early 6th century. And if you go to Gwangju, to the Gwangju National Museum, you will be seeing these earrings. And I want you to actually look at them very, very closely because I have a homework for you when you look at those earrings. First of all, we have basically a large, long pendant and what looks like little leaf-shaped designs that were cut from a sheet of gold, very thinly plated sheet of gold. And see those round or leaf-shaped gold sequins? So these were attached by some kind of a wire, right? There's a lot of kind of wire onto which these were attached. And this is actually a technique that was known throughout Eurasia, which basically shows us that Paekche was taking part in that larger trend of goldsmithing techniques. Another technique we can see here is the granulation technique. So these were small round granules attached to the surface using different solutions and heat. And granulation is one of the most difficult techniques in goldsmithing. And the Paekche and also the Silla artisans really excelled at that. And sometimes, because it was so difficult, sometimes artisans imitated that by creating raised dots. And what I want you to do when you go to the Gwangju National Museum is look at the gold artifacts and look for the granulation and look very closely to see if these are actually small round granules separately attached to the piece or if they are just raised dots, which is basically just an imitation of the granulation technique, okay? So granulation, again, has been used all over the world. It can be found in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt. The Scythians actually brought it to East Asia around 300 BCE. And then it was imported into Paekche around the time when, let me say, just Nangnang or Lilang and maybe other areas that had a Chinese influence. So through those colonies, it came into Paekche. And some techniques that we see in Paekche, such as granulation or the attachment of these gold sequins, can also be found in Silla goldsmithing. But the Silla, if you Google Silla crown, you will see these large crowns with these comma-shaped beads, and these were actually luxury objects coming in from Wa, Japan. And this is something that we don't see as much in Paekche and in Shilla. So again, similar goldsmithing techniques, but every country added their own take, had their own preferences as to, which decoration technique to emphasize and which kind of motifs that they would use. Now comes the time when you have to use the chat. And I would like you to write into the chat box which one of those pieces is from Paekche and where you think the other piece on the slide is from. Susanna is saying the left one is from Paekche because it was on one of the first slides. Yes, left one is Paekche. Okay, yes, you're right. The left one is from Paekche. But what about the one on the right? Albina is thinking the one on the right might be from Schiller. Susanna is thinking maybe it's modern. These are all possibilities, all possible. Well, do you see some similarities between the two? Remember, I just talked about the little sequence and I talked about granulation technique. Stephanie is saying maybe the one on the right is from a different country. Yes, we're getting there. Yes, very good. So let me show you what it is. So the one on the left, as you said, is from the tomb of King Muryong. And the one on the right is actually from Tilla from Afghanistan. It's a gold crown that was found in one of the tombs. It is from 100 BCE to 100 CE. So a couple hundred years prior to the Paekche gold that we are looking at on the left-hand side. So looking at similarities first, what we see, we have a similar technique in the sense that the design was cut from a very thinly plated gold sheet. And then in both cases, we have those round sequins attached with wire. But the one from Afghanistan has a little longer wire. So it would be tingling, it would be moving around a little bit more when the person would move ahead, right? And what's different though is the motif. So on the left-hand side, we have this kind of flame-shaped design with like a floral ornamentation, more floral ornamentation on the top, and then I will get to what that might be in a little bit. So in the case of Paekche, those ornaments, there are two of them because they were attached to the sides of the of a black silk cap, and so they would basically stick out on the left-hand side above the ear. Whereas in the case of the gold crown from Tilla, this was an entire crown that would be placed on the top of the head, right? And as you can imagine, when, there is a different sense of like visual impact, right? With the gold crown, you would move around and everything would just shine and, be reflected from the sun. When with these, there's a different sense of aesthetic, right? It's not so much about shining, like little pieces shining, but it's more the height and the motif that seem to have been interesting for the king, because the sequins are not that big. You see that? And they're also very closely attached to the plate, to the sheet. So it seems like the king really wanted the motifs to stand out. Yeah, and this is the Schiller crown. You see, the Tilla crown has this kind of tree-shaped design. And this is, interestingly, something that we see in Schiller as well. We have a similar kind of tree-shaped design. But then in comparison to the Paekche pieces, you see there are none of these Wa Japanese beads, right? But in terms of the granulation technique with the earrings, we have something similar in Schiller as well. So again, we got some parallel developments, but also then unique features in each of those kingdoms and dynasties. Okay. Now, what my students really love is when I tell them a little bit about traces of the artisans who actually made those pieces. It's always nice, when you look at pottery, to see a fingerprint of the artist or something. And in this case, and this is a detail from this flame-like ornament for the crown that we just looked at, you see on one side, the artisan tried to decorate the rim with this dotted line, but we don't see this anywhere else, just there. And a scholar, Zhu Gyongmi, she actually thinks that this may have been stopped because the artisan realized, if I continue doing that, I might break the thin base sheet. And so this is basically a trace of kind of trial and error. He tried something or she tried something and then it didn't work out and then they just stopped, right? But this also gives you a nice detail of the wiring technique, right? Wiring and then adding the little plate. Another question for you, please put it in the chat if you have any suggestions. So the central motif seems to be a lotus flower from which more flowers seem to grow out of, right? You got the central flower and then more like 3 little flowers like sprouting, like a little sprout coming out of the main flower. And lotus is generally considered a Buddhist motif because lotus grows out from the mud and it's considered a flower of like symbolizing like purity. It's also the flower that people who believe in Amitabha's Pure Land believe to be reborn out of when they are reborn in Amitabha's Sukhavati. So it is, it has many Buddhist connotations. But, and here's my question for you, what else do you think could a lotus flower symbolize? Can you associate the lotus flower with anything else but Buddhism? Any idea what that might be? Rina, purity, yes, being pure. Yeah, that could be also taken as more general idea, right? The idea of purity or pureness, yes. And Albina is saying it could symbolize life and the long reign of the dynasty. Oh, that's a good guess as well. Very good. Yes. So if you look at the use of the lotus motif in other types of artifacts, whether it's pottery or textile design, gold or silver ornaments, you know, the lotus can actually mean many different things. It can mean purity, it can mean wealth, it can mean prosperity. So it can mean many different things. And so although many scholars say, oh, this is a lotus motif, this is a Buddhist motif coming from Central Asia, this may be the case, but it does not necessarily have something to do with Buddhism, just because that's what we think it is, right, primarily. And so I would say it's just a general like decorative motif to be used for ornament for the king's cap. What is more interesting is what we see below. And this is actually a grape pattern. And grapes were not indigenous to South Korea or to the Korean peninsula. And so the grape pattern, as well as the flame motif of the entire ornament, probably came from Central Asia. So when we look at Buddhist cave sites along the Silk Roads, we actually see the flame motif, we see, of course, the lotus flower, and we see grape motifs as well. So in that sense, we have these foreign motifs being incorporated into the king's head ornament. Now, my question for you is why? We just noticed that it seems to have been really important for the king to highlight those motifs, right? There is no dangling of those little sequins that would obscure the view of those motifs. So it must have been very important for him to have that be very clear. So why do you think that is? Any idea? Wow, Sarah, that was fast. Maybe because foreign products symbolized wealth and luxury. Very good. Albina, excellent, to show off power and dominance. Katerina, emphasize good relations with foreign countries. Excellent. And Marika is saying it could mean that they were inspired by foreign trends and maybe symbolizing good relationships to other nations or expanding their territory. These are all excellent thoughts. Very good, everyone. Yes, that's exactly the case. So by showing his knowledge of decorative motifs from other countries, the king was basically showing off his power and his authority, right? Exactly. That's exactly the case. Very good, everyone. So we looked at this gold crown from Tilla Tepe in Afghanistan. And, you know, there are thousands of miles between, and there are also hundreds of centuries between Tilla Tepe and Paekche, right? So what's in between? Well, there's a large landmass that is considered, that is usually referred to as Central Asia, right? And we got all these different nomadic tribes in Central Asia. Among them, the two most dominant ones were the Xianbei and the Xiongnu. And the Xiongnu were Proto-Turkic nomads that used gold lavishly. The Murong, Xianbei were Turkic and Mongolic groups that also used gold quite a bit, and they used a tree design. And this is the similar kind of design that we saw in Tepe, we saw it in Schiller, but for some reason, it doesn't really appear in Paekche gold. And that's really interesting. Instead, we see flame motifs. So this seems to have been a preference of the Paekche kings. And what you see here, that seems to be a Xianbei take on gold material, is that they combined this kind of gold leaf-shaped design and added ornaments, including turquoise. So the addition of jewels is something that we don't really see in Schiller or Paekche, right? So this, again, is a kind of a difference. But what those nomadic tribes and Paekche and Schiller have in common is that they were all using gold. And the good thing, the nice thing about gold is actually it requires minimal tools and a limited workforce. Of course, that workforce has to be very, very well educated in how to use gold, but you can get a lot out of using a relatively small workforce, relatively small amount of raw material to create something really impressive. So that's why the nomads were able to have that kind of workforce. And it seems to have been something that was manageable for the Paekche and the Schiller kings as well. Okay, so to summarize our little excursion into Paekche gold before we move on to the Buddhist artifacts, Paekche gold was basically reserved for the royal family. They monopolized the use of gold, silver, and gilt bronze objects. Basically, nobody else was allowed to use those metalwork objects, only the royal family. And in the tombs, they found various types of ornaments. Some were created for the burial, others were probably used during the lifetime. So one could think that the king and the queen probably wore these earrings and ornaments during really important, like royal processions or ceremonies. So for specific events, they would be worn, and they show the influx of motifs and techniques from West and Central Asia in terms of the granulation and those little small disc shapes. But what the Schiller, actually more than Paekche, they really excelled at the granulation technique. So when you go to the Gyeongju National Museum, I really want you to look closely and appreciate how the artisans really excelled at the granulation technique. That's something that we see only in the Three Kingdoms in Korea. Okay, now moving a little bit to a later period, to the Sabi period from the 6th to 7th century. So what we see emerge in that time period, in the Sabi period particularly, is the construction of Buddhist temples. So my question for you is, how do you think did the Paekche people, like the average person, how did they live? And what kind of dwellings did they live? Maybe the professor who taught the Paekche history class lecture talked a little bit about that. But how do you imagine the average Paekche person lived? In what kind of house? Susanna is saying there were strict rules about who could have what size of house. Very good. There were indeed very strict rules. Yes. Marika is saying they probably lived in simple straw house. Yeah, you mean the little thatched roofs, houses, clay. Yes, Lehmhäuser, I know what you're talking about. So prior to the Sabi period, the Paekche people actually lived underground. So they dug holes and then they lived in these pits. It's called like pit dwelling. Okay, so they lived in these pits and they was just covered with a very simple kind of thatched roof. And it was also only in the Sabi period when they went above ground and the average Paekche person started to have a little hut, like a little one-room hut above ground, and again with a thatched roof. Now imagine you live in this very, very simple dwelling, right? And then you visit some of these Buddhist monasteries that the kings had constructed. And this is a model of Miruksa, of Maitreya Monastery, of which you saw the actual site in the very first slide of this lecture. So what we have is we have a very tall wooden pagoda in the center, and on the left and on the right we have two like stone pagodas. Just look at the entire compound, like these three courtyards, and then in the back there's another like lecture hall, and all these corridors have all tiled roofs, right? It was like a spectacular sight. It's something, similar to, someone in medieval Europe entering a cathedral, right, and having this kind of experience of, wow, look at this tall building, right? So in a similar way, that's how impressive Buddhist temple architecture was to the average Paekche person. And when you go to the Gwangju National Museum, you will see a lot of these tiles on display, roof tiles on display. And you might think, or now that you have learned from me a little bit more about it, but the average person, I think, who goes there might just think, roof tiles, what about it? Every house today has roof tiles, so what's special, right? But back then, in the 5th, 6th, 7th century, that was very special, because basically only the royal palace and Buddhist temples had roof tiles. Everything else was just thatched roofs. These buildings really stood out in the landscape. And another thing that really stood out of the landscape were these pagodas, these really tall pagodas. So imagine looking at Paekche from like a bird eye's view and looking down, and then there would be these pagodas, they would stick out and mark the landscape and basically symbolize royal power in the periphery of the kingdom, right? If the king was building those temples outside of the capital, it would basically were symbols of his power, his authority. And then inside of those pagodas, archaeologists, the wooden pagoda burned down, basically everything burned down of the Midoksa. The only thing that remains are these remains of the stone pagodas. And inside of those pagodas are relics. So this is another site, Wanghengsa, and just I want you to remember that this temple is right next to a river. It was built by King Widok for his deceased son. And why would temples be built along the river, right? We will get back to that question in a little bit. What I want to emphasize in this slide is the relics and what was interred along with the relics. So the relics basically are remains of what is believed to be the remains of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, right? A little bone piece, or Buddhist scriptures could also be enshrined inside the pagoda, because the Buddha's text and what the Buddha said is also kind of a text relic, right? So Buddhist scriptures, actual bone relics would be enshrined in these pagodas to turn the architectural structure into something that could be worshipped. So people would circumambulate around the pagoda and praying to the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. The pagoda was the central part of the monastery back then. And look what else was enshrined in the pagoda. All these little bracelets and belts and glass beads. So these were all very luxurious items that were imported into Paekche. And people, the aristocrats and the royal family, basically donated all those items to the monastery at the time when they finished the building. And what really happens in the Sabi period is we see a slight change. So people buried the deceased in a very simple tombs with very few artifacts, burial goods. And the aristocrats and the royal family put all their wealth and their devotion into the support of Buddhist temples. And that might be one of the reasons why we have more than 8,000 of these ritual offering pieces in the Wanghengsa monastery's pagoda. And another way how Paekche kings tried to strengthen their rule was Paekche, Chilla, and Goguryeo had perhaps a very different take on Buddhism, that the kind of Buddhism that you may be familiar with. So Buddhism is not just a religion, it is also a political tool. And it has been a political tool in pre-modern times, and to a certain extent even today. When the Paekche kings decided that they want to adopt the Buddhist faith, it was also because they believed in the strong spiritual powers of those Buddhas that would help them rule the country, right? One of the most important rituals that Buddhist monks would conduct on behalf of the kings was rain rituals. In an agricultural society, the ability to pray for rain and get rain was really, really crucial, right? And so Buddhism was adopted by the Baekje kings because it was because it was a political tool. And what the Baekje kings did was they basically declared Paekche the land of Maitreya. Maitreya is another Buddha, aside from the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. And they would construct temples like Maitreya Monastery or Miduksa in order to have basically state-funded temples where Buddhist monks would pray for the country, for the protection of the country. As you know, there was always Goguryeo. Goguryeo was the biggest enemy, right? So we wanted to make sure that you always had the Buddhas on your side protecting you from those invasions. So the Maitreya faith actually was one of the most important faiths in the Korean Peninsula until the 7th century. And there are two different types of Maitreyas. There is a Buddha and a Bodhisattva version. So there is a Bodhisattva Maitreya. So Bodhisattva is a divine being that has not completely reached awakening yet, but vowed to help other beings and reach enlightenment before they themselves go into nirvana. And so the Maitreya version of the Bodhisattva lives in Tushita heaven. And then the other version is the Buddha Maitreya, which is the future Buddha. He lives in Ketumati, which is the name of his Pure Land. And at some point in time, the Buddha Maitreya will come down on earth and teach in the so-called dragon flower assemblies. And related to that, there's basically an ascending cult in the Three Kingdoms period where people hoped to ascend to the Bodhisattva Maitreya, to live with him in Tushita heaven. So this is similar to the idea of rebirth in Amitabha's Pure, and maybe you've heard of Amitabha before. And the other version, the other side of that faith in Maitreya is the descending cult. So in that case, devotees hoped to be reborn when the future Buddha would come to earth. And so they hoped to be able to listen to Maitreya Buddha's sermons in the three dragon flower assemblies. Now, putting all those little puzzle pieces together, when we look at the Miduksa temple site, what do you see? You see 3 courtyards with 3 pagodas and 3 Buddha halls. So there's a logic behind that. So basically, we have an example of the descending Maitreya cult here. So what King Mu basically wanted with the building of the site is he wanted to prepare a site where the future Buddha Maitreya could descend on. He wanted to create a Buddha land for the Maitreya, hoping that he could gain merits and could declare Baekje a Buddha land where a Buddha resides. Now, getting to my last example of Buddhist art, this also is from the Sabi period, and it's located in today's South Chungcheong province in Seosan, and it's at the top of a mountain. You have to walk up quite a bit actually to get there. And this photograph shows a monk performing a ritual in front of what is a rock-carved triad. So a triad is a combination of 3 figures, and we have what seems like a central figure with 2 adjacent figures. Oh, and by the way, if you look down from there, you actually see a river, going along, and people could potentially look up and might have seen the triad. Okay, why is this triad so famous? It is famous because of the so-called Paekche smile. So if you look at the facial features of these 3 figures, you notice how all 3 have very full, very rounded faces with a very full cheeks and a full, smooth lips. And they all seem to be having like a faint smile. Just to remind yourself that this is the current 21st century conditions. Back in the Paekche kingdom, this was all painted, okay, like with the Greek statues, right? It was all painted originally. So you can see that originally this Buddha had pupils, etc. And there was also a little jewel added to the forehead that symbolized the urna. And then we have the Ujnisha, the little traditional top knot. So the top knot and the urna and the nimbus. These are all part of the iconography that tells us that this is a Buddha figure. And so the central figure basically has two like hand gestures, fear not gesture and wish granting gesture. And on the sides, we have another standing figure of potentially an Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva. And on the other side, and this is really interesting because usually when you have a standing Buddha figure, usually little two standing bodhisattvas are attached. And the combination of a seated figure is somewhat unusual. And this is also one of the reasons why the Sosan Triad is so known for this really unusual configuration of those three figures. And this figure is seated and has the right leg crossed over the left knee. And this kind of bodhisattva in contemplation is something that we also see in Chilla, right? And it could just be a bodhisattva, any bodhisattva just waiting and contemplating. But some scholars believe that this is actually a representation of Maitreya Bodhisattva. So this would be symbolizing the ascending version, the ascending cult of the Maitreya faith. And some scholars believe that this is representing the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. Others, however, think that this is Maitreya, Buddha, flanked by a Bodhisattva Maitreya. So basically the Sosan Triad could represent the ascending and the descending version of the Maitreya faith. And talking about the function of the Sosan Triad. Now, when you think about it, Paekche had lost the Han River Basin to Goguryeo in 475, I think. And so the Sosan Triad and also the Taean Triad were basically were protecting Paekche from the invasions from Goguryeo at the northern part of the territory. And what's also interesting is that the Sosan Triad is next to a river, and so we have a lot of trade ships passing. So you could imagine a merchant, in the vessel looking up to the Sosan Triad and praying for protection, right? Because some of these vessels were then going on to their journey to China. So you would want to make sure that you would be praying to the Buddhas for protection during your long journey. Again, talking about the artisan, the people who actually made those artifacts, right? That's something I always emphasize in my lectures, that we can appreciate the skills that these artisans brought to the site. And just remind you, whenever you look at the Mayabul, at a stone-carved Buddha, remember that a lot of the stone in Korea is made from granite. And granite is one of the hardest stones you can imagine. The sophistication of the tools that were required to work with granite is really something that we need to appreciate and consider. And then also, the Masons were considering how they would position the sculptures. So the Sosan Triad was carved in a 10-degree angle. And they were also carved, you look at the upper part, do you notice how the faces and the upper torso is much more three-dimensional than the lower part? You see how the lower part of all three figures is much flatter? So what happens if you carve something in an angle and you carve out the upper portion much more strongly, so it sticks out a little bit more, is that when you kneel down as a devotee and you look up to the figure, you can see the faces much more clearly, right? So people were like the Masons who created the Sosan Triad had the ritual function of the triad in mind when they were carving these. Okay, and then looking at Buddhist art, we can really learn how the cultural interactions work in the East Asian cultural sphere. And we can learn a lot about the maritime connections with Wei and Liang and other dynasties. In particular, when we look at Buddhist sculpture from the Liaodong and from the Shandong Peninsula, we see quite a few similarities between those and those made in the Paekche Kingdom. And another thing, the Liang kings actually sent artisans to Paekche. So at some point in time, I think it was in the 5th century, Paekche artisans learned from Liang artisans that had been sent to Paekche. So there was not just an indirect cultural transfer, but also a direct cultural transfer of tools, of techniques from Liang to Paekche. And this is just a quick example, one of many, many more. Just look at this Bodhisattva from Eastern Wei that is now in the Smithsonian Institution in DC, in Washington, DC, and just compare the nimbus. You see a similar kind of floral-shaped nimbus that is framed by this kind of flame shape. The Paekche artisans really seem to have liked this kind of flame shape. We saw a similar kind of flame shape with the gold ornament, right? And we see this here as well, shaping or framing the Bodhisattva from Eastern Wei, from northern China. Okay, and this is my last slide before I get into the conclusion slide. So again, I want you to think critically about how we interpret source material, okay? Because 20th century scholarship really shapes our perception, our interpretation of Korean history and Korean art. And when we look at, gold artifacts or Buddhist artifacts, we're basically looking at elite culture, right? We don't really know what the average Paekche person had in their little dwellings, and what kind of understanding that the average Paekche person had that came up to the site, to the Joseon Triad in the 6th, 7th century, and looked at these figures. What might they have thought about those figures? The Joseon Triad actually was completely unknown until 1959. It's when then director of the Buyeo National Museum, Hong Sa-jun, did some field research in the area, in the Joseon area. And he asked villagers, what do you have in your area? Is there anything noteworthy that I should record for us to study, that should be registered as a cultural treasure? And then the villagers in Joseon told him, there was a local lumberjack that said, oh yeah, if you go up this hill, you will actually see a rock-cut sanshin, so a mountain god, a mountain deity, with his 2 wives. And so Hong Sa-jun went up, and then this is what he saw. This is a picture taken prior to 69 when they added a little ritual aside to it. So you could clearly see the river that runs right below the Joseon Triad. Right? That's when the study of the Joseon Triad started in the late 50s and in the 60s. And so our understanding of, oh, this is a Buddha, oh, this is a Bodhisattva, is an understanding that actually only a few might have had in the Paekche kingdom. Only the royalty and the aristocrats. So the average person may have just thought, oh, these might be very powerful spirits that I should pray to. So again, the identity of images can change over time, and what this local lumberjack might have thought in the 1950s might be very different from what those images were believed to be in the Joseon dynasty or in the Paekche kingdom. Okay, so always keep in mind when we identify a certain object that this is not the ultimate final identification, that iconography can change in meaning over time. Okay, so in my final slide, just want to say that Paekche artisans really were creative in adopting foreign cultures, including different motifs, different styles, different techniques. In terms of the Paekche gold we looked at the beginning, we learned that there were several different traditions being part of that, also influences from Central Asia. And then when we look at Buddhist temples and carved Buddhas from the Paekche kingdom, we learned that Buddhism was not just a religion, but it was also a political tool for state protection. And of course, people also hoped to be reborn in Maitreya's land when they died. And I have additional slides about the Paekche gilt bronze, Paekche incense burner. So if you're interested, we can talk more about that in the Q&A. If not, I can just stop here, and I'm ready for Q&A if you like. I see Albina had a question about the halos. I can get back to that after I talked about the. Okay, so I see a movement on the floor for more slides. Okay, I can talk a little bit more about the incense burner then. The incense burner, right? whenever you talk about Paekche art, the incense burner is the one that everyone in Korea will tell you about. Oh, the incense burner, this is such a great thing, right? This is the hallmark of Paekche art. Everybody will talk about that. So the incense burner was actually found just a couple of years ago, like maybe 15 years ago or so, at what used to be Nungsa, the royal tomb temple, next to the Sabi period royal cemetery. And there we have a link that I want you to remember. So what happened was King Chang and his sister had Nungsa built in 567 for their deceased father, King Song. Do you know what happened to King Song? So there was actually some warfare between Paekche and Shilla, I believe. So King Song and Chang, who was at that point crown prince. So the crown prince actually pushed for war with Shilla. So King Song and then the crown prince, they went and fought against the Shilla. And what happened was King Song's head was cut off and Shilla kept the head and they sent only the rest of the corpse back to Paekche. And so King Song died a really, really horrible death. And so King Chang, his son, and his sister, they built the structure to basically pray for the well-being of their father in the afterlife, right? They hoped that it would all be good and he would be reborn in Maitreya's paradise, heaven. So it is believed that this temple was built right next to the cemetery to pray, to console the spirit of the father. Okay, so that's the spatial context of where the incense burner was found. And then in terms of the composition, so it basically has 4 parts that were all like made separately. So we have a dragon-shaped base, and we have a bird shape, it's probably a phoenix-shaped finial on top of a cover that seems like mountain shapes, right? And then we have a little kind of large bowl. And so the top has these large mountains and peaks, and in between we have little bees and little beings, and then at the bottom bowl we have little animals, and I will show you some details of that. Now my question for you is, what do you think was in the bowl? First of all, why do they have to make an incense burner with gilt bronze? Maybe you have a little incense burner at home. Some of you may have made some things made from wood, or they are also clay. In the Paekche and also in the Chinese sphere, there were also incense burners made from clay, actually, not just gilt bronze. But why the use of gilt bronze? Any idea? What did they put into this little bowl? Oh, that's a very good guess, Marika. There may have been the father's ashes inside. Actually, the idea of cremation, which is associated with Buddhism, right? That you cremate the remains and then have only the ashes. This is actually a tradition that became more mainstream in Korea only in the Goryeo in the 10th, 11th century. Until then, the people that lived on the Korean peninsula did bury the corpse in its entirety. What people in Paekche, Goryeo also did was wind burial. So people would just leave the corpse out in the open, and it would just be eaten by birds and stuff. So wind burial and burial in the ground in coffins were some of the ways in which people buried the dead. So cremation is much later tradition. Any other ideas what they may have put into the bowl other than ashes? Good guess, Marika, though. Good guess. Rice? Yeah, that's another good guess. Gold? Aha. Albina, so Susanna thinks more about food. Albina thinks more about maybe some kind of a precious item being placed in there. So what I omitted in this description is that they're actually, you see that here? The little holes? They're actually little holes in the top part. So what happens? The elite, the aristocrats, the king and the queen, and this is something that we see in the Korean peninsula as well as in all these different Chinese dynasties at the time, 4th, 5th, 6th century, is that people, the rich and the wealthy, surrounded themselves with these very luxurious items. And some of these luxurious items were different types of incense, okay, that were imported from like South Asia. So you may have some incense that you burn, right? But back then, the incense itself was not burned, but in the bowl was basically charcoal. and then the incense pieces were put onto the charcoal, okay? And once you did that, then you had a kind of a long-lasting scent coming from the glowing. The incense was basically glowing on the charcoal, and then you had the fumes coming from these little holes at the top. You get that concept? Is that clear? Right? So charcoal, incense on top, and then you got these little holes where the incense would come out. Okay? Because of the themes, because of the motifs, right? We got the dragon. Oh, and oftentimes, because when you put charcoal into a metal container, the metal container gets hot, right? And so the dragon actually symbolizes water, right? And that's why we have this kind of dragon at the bottom. And oftentimes those items, those incense burners, would be placed into a large bowl of water to kind of cool down the bronze. Because of the motifs of the little like immortals and the summits, this incense burner is largely believed to have a kind of Taoist connotation, right? So you got these immortals, you got these beautiful little human figures playing instruments. So scholars believe that this is symbolizing this kind of Taoist realm of like Taoist people. Here, for instance, we have a little person that seems to be meditating, right? And then we have another figure, a little horse rider. You see the horse rider, and with an arrow. Do you see the arrow? Right. So he's basically, and then this is his bow, and these are his arrows, and he's basically looking back, horse riding. So when we look into Goguryeo tombs, we actually see a similar kind of motif of the hunter on horseback, right? And then when we look at the lower part, we also see animals. So on the left side is basically a monkey, right? They didn't really know what a monkey looked like back then in Paekche, and so they had an idea. And on the right hand side is an elephant, and somebody riding an elephant. So these were all these fantasy animals that people just imagined, right? Because they didn't have that in Paekche. And here we have a little tiger. And this is a lower portion, again, showing us what the bowl looks like. And so there are different ideas as to the meaning of the incense, the so-called incense burner. I think in my scholarship, I look a lot at like spatial context, spatial relations. So when looking at that, we can definitely say if it was close to the royal cemetery, it was probably used during like annual rituals held for the deceased king. So you would imagine that there was probably some kind of a hall where the incense burner would be placed on a kind of an altar with maybe also a Buddha image or maybe the portrait of the deceased king or something. And then on these very special days, the incense burner would be used. But the incense burner could, not this one, but maybe other types of incense burners were also used in mundane settings. So the very rich and wealthy in Paekche, they had this type of incense burner in their bedchamber, in their homes, and they would just use that to fume, to have this like nice, luxurious scent that would also perfume their clothes, for instance, right? So we need to look at the use of and the function of incense burners in the more like general, like Paekche context. Okay, I see some questions about the dragon. Yes, the dragon traditionally symbolizes water. So oftentimes when people in pre-modern East Asia prayed for rain, they would pray for the dragon. They would pray to the dragon. Yes, so dragons were guardians of rivers. Exactly. So there's always this connection between dragon and water. That's right, Lisbeth. Very good. And Susanna has a question about being buried in the royal cemetery. So his corpse was buried in the cemetery, but his head was buried in Schiller. The Schiller kept his head as a war trophy. So the head was not there, but the rest of the body was buried in Paekche. So that was my understanding of the incense burner. I have, I think, 2-3 more slides. I can talk a little bit about people that were not really listening to the king. So, in fact, until the 3rd century CE, the entire Korean peninsula only had these little statelets, right? And it was only when we have actual Paekche, Schiller, and Goguryeo actually much longer than Paekche and Shilla actually. But Paekche was able to, the Paekche king, the first Paekche king was able to unify all these different statelets. But in the, what is now Gwangju, Naju, Mokpo, Muan, this kind of area, which is called the Yongsan River region, they had their own thing going on, right? Very close to China, very close to Japan. They were kind of semi-independent from the Paekche center. And so scholars nowadays think that people who lived there were very strong, and they basically had a very loose vertical alliance with the center, with the Paekche king. And what we see in that region, and actually it stopped around the Paekche, but until the Paekche period, we have these jar burials. So if you go into national museums in what is now Cholla, you will see these jar burials, these pots that remain from that tradition. People are still trying to figure out why we see this appear. So in the early times, we see very simple burial forms, and then this tradition of this is an example of the actual jar burials. So in the beginning, around 1st century BCE, people just had, people were making pots, right? Like, for household jars where they would keep their sauces and whatnot. So when they buried the dead, they would just put those two household jars together, and basically they added an additional function to the use of those jars as burial jars, basically. And then those jars kept on getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then at some point, as you can see here, they had become humongous. Think about also the artisanship. Pottery is not just about, what do I have? I have actually making a little jar like this is doable, right? But think about the firing technique and the skills and firing technique required to make a large jar, right? You have to make sure that it doesn't break in the firing. You have to pot it thinly enough, but not too thick, so it fires all through. So there was kind of a sophisticated firing skills required to make those types of jars. So the Paekche, I would say, were perhaps, from our modern viewpoint, perhaps a little bit more sophisticated in the way how they buried their dead, because in Shilla, actually, they had the people die with the king. So when the king in Shilla died, the wives and the concubines and servants, they all had to die with him. And you basically had the Shilla king's tomb, and then at the lower part of the tomb, you had the other people buried along with him. Of course, in Shilla, there were also burial figurines later on that replaced the killing of relatives of the king. But in Paekche, they were using those burials. So they actually buried only the people who actually died, didn't kill any other people. They buried the people, they did not bury the ashes, but they buried the entire corpse. So another really interesting finding are keyhole-shaped tombs. Is anyone doing Japanese studies and Korean studies by any chance? So if you know a little bit about early Japanese archaeology, you will know that there are a lot of these keyhole-shaped tombs in the southern part of Japan, so Kyushu and also Osaka area. Guess what? A lot of these keyhole tombs were also found in the Yongsan River Basin. Now, what does this tell us about the Yongsan River Basin culture and its relations to Wa, right? So there must have been something going on. Why were there perhaps people from the archipelago that lived in the Yongsan River region? What does this tell us about the impact of Wa in that region, etc., etc.? So we don't really know yet much about this. Actually, one of my colleagues that also did their UCLA, did their PhD at UCLA, wrote his dissertation about those keyhole-shaped tombs. His name is Dennis Lee. So in case you wanted to learn more about that, just try to look up that dissertation.